Unless we came up with found a cache with
Yeah.
all sorts of manuscripts
Well,
that
that's
really
it.
were, yeah.
Yeah. No, but every time we find something, it doesn't give us much new evidence. And new manuscripts are discovered all the time, and sometimes they're early manuscripts, and they almost never give us something new. And so, if they did find a copy of something that was really different from the Gospel of Mark, for example, then probably it wasn't the Gospel of Mark; it was some other gospel.
Right.
And so, yeah. So
Does it
I don't stay awake at night wondering whether I got the text of Mark. I think actually we're as close as we're ever going to get. Probably. I mean, it might change. You got to be open to it changing, but it's kind of hard to figure out what would change it. So
Yeah, and just to wrap that one up with a little bow and icing on the cake is the internal evidence within the text themselves. The difficulty we read the Gospels, they act like they're being written in the 30s, or at least they're trying to place the narrative in the 30s, it seems.
yeah,
But in reality, most Christians, even that are extremely conservative, would still say decades later, a couple decades later, 50s, 60s. Whereas we're going to go past the war because there seems to be some ex eventu material going on in the Gospel of Mark. And then, of course, everything else adds from there, using Mark probably. The question is, how do we pin that down if they're writing decades and decades and decades later, let's say, pretending to be in a certain time, as if
yeah.
this is when this is really happening? How do we deal with that in light of everything we just discussed?
Okay. So now we have three questions, and the problem is most people don't keep these questions straight. My students have a really difficult time keeping these questions straight. So, question number one: you have all these manuscripts. Do they give us what Mark originally wrote, or
Right.
pretty close to it? Okay. Okay. So you date the manuscript. Then, second question: when was Mark writing? A separate question. And how do you establish on a different date? And so, as you're saying, most scholars date him around 70 for reasons not related to the manuscripts, the dating of the manuscripts. But then Mark's writing 70 and he's reporting events from 40 years earlier. Have do we know that he's accurately reporting the events from those times earlier? So those are three different questions, and they have to be decided on three different grounds. So the accuracy of what Mark said is different from the accuracy of what the manuscript said Mark said. See what I mean? And
Yeah.
it's a completely different question. So the question of the accuracy of the Gospels is a whole another thing, and there are a different set of scholars who typically I deal with all of that, but most scholars pick something. And so how do you know what the historical Jesus really said and did? How do you know how Mark is representing changes of those stories based on his oral traditions and his own editorial interests? And how do you know how the manuscripts changed what Mark said? And so, yeah. So if you have a question among those three, I'm happy to answer.
No, absolutely. It's a very complex issue. I wanted to, I guess we did show how complex this is, even in the conversation. It's a deep dive. So moving on to the next one. What are the Chester Beatty papyri and when are they dated? Is it true they include the earliest copies of portions of the Pauline corpus?
Yeah. So the Chester Beatty papyri were published in about 100 years ago or so. They the background of this, again, it's complicated. People, a lot of people know the King James version, of course. The King James version is an English translation of Greek, of the Greek text of the New Testament. The Greek text of the New Testament that the King James translators in 1611 were using was an edition that had been originally produced soon after the invention of printing, had been produced by a scholar, a European scholar named Erasmus in the 16th century. And he had a few manuscripts available to him, not very ancient manuscripts, but a few manuscripts available that he decided, what is a printer going to print? A printer wants to print the New Testament, right? Well, what do you print? I mean, you don't have any printed editions yet. And so like you got to print a Greek, you want to print a Greek text so people will have it in printing instead of having manuscripts. So well, somebody has to decide because you got all these manuscripts and they're different from each other. So Erasmus came up with this thing. He said, okay, we're going to print this. And they printed that. And the King James translators then translated that. So in 1611. So about 200 years later or so, no, I'm sorry. About 200 years later in the 19th century, scholars started thinking, that Greek edition that they were translating there, we have all these new manuscripts that they didn't know about, and they're different from that. And so they started working on how to know what the original text said, given all these different manuscripts. At the end of the 19th century, there were two British scholars named Westcott and Hort, who decided that the Greek version that the King James is based on was flawed, seriously flawed. It had the woman taken in adultery, which you mentioned earlier. It had the last 12 verses of Mark. It had lots of differences. They came up with a new edition of the Greek New Testament that was based on what they considered to be the oldest and best manuscripts. Okay, so that's in the 1880s. About 40 years later, they started discovering even older manuscripts. And the Chester Beatty papyri were the most significant early find. They include large portions of a number of the books of the New Testament. They are fragmentary, but there are early copies of some of the Gospels and of Paul's letters that date to around the year 200. Westcott and Hort were basing their decisions on manuscripts dating from the 4th century, from around 370. Some of your listeners will know about Codex Sinaiticus or Codex Vaticanus. These were the two big ones for Westcott and Hort. So the issue is when the Chester Beatty papyri were discovered, now you've got manuscripts that are over a century earlier from what our text is based on. And since then, they've discovered hundreds of, not hundreds, over 100 of these older manuscripts. And the reality is that despite these discoveries, Westcott and Hort's edition is still basically what we use today.
Wow.
Because the evidence is supporting what they found, what they found and what they conjectured. These are two really smart guys, especially Hort was really into this. And they conjectured what future discoveries would be, and they were right. And so these papyri, they don't completely coincide with what Westcott and Hort came up with. But when you look at the totality of these discoveries, starting with the Chester Beatty papyri, you can see that in fact they're right. And so our editions haven't changed much since then.